Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining the Yachad campaign evening. Welcome. It's great to have you with us. My name is Simon Sadie. I'm the chair of Yachad. It's great that you can all join us this evening with the backdrop of a difficult year for us all, and with the political landscape in Israel still in a state of uncertainty. It's possible for us all to feel a bit pessimistic about the short-term future of Israel, this country in which we are all so invested. So I hope that this evening will be inspiring and uplifting for us all. And I also hope that this evening you'll take the opportunity to help us raise funds for our work, because that is absolutely essential if we're going to continue doing all the good work that we do. I'm really delighted that tonight's evening will be hosted by Sir Simon Schama, and he will be joined by 4 Israelis who represent a new generation of upcoming political leaders committed to Israel's future as a country based on the principles of democracy and equality. What I'd like to do is just briefly explain the format of the evening. I think we've all become very used to the joys of Zoom in the past year, though, so you should be familiar with what's going to happen now. You should shortly hear from Sir Simon, and then I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you to support the work of Yachad. Following this, Sir Simon will return for a conversation with our guests. Now, although you won't physically be able to ask questions in the main Zoom call or using the chat function, we will be offering everybody the opportunity to chat directly to one of our 4 guests in a breakout room at the end of the session. So please do make a note of any burning questions that you had, and then take the opportunity to go to a breakout room at the end and ask away. And of course, please do remember also to donate to Yachad tonight, because we can't succeed without your support. Okay, I'm sure everyone here this evening is familiar with Sir Simon Schama. He's a world-acclaimed historian, educator, and broadcaster. Sir Simon specializes in art history, Dutch history, Jewish history, French history, history of all kinds. He is currently the professor of history and art history at Columbia University in New York. And that's where he joins us from now. Sir Simon is the author of many popular and important books on both history and art history, and those books, translated into about 15 languages, have won the Wolfson Award for History, the W.H. Smith Prize for Literature, and the National Academy of Arts and Letters Awards for Literature. Simon's Wikipedia entry I noticed today lists him as a Tottenham Hotspur supporter, which, if true, is a burden which he and I share, and which at least means that amongst all these many successes he's had in life, there's still some room for disappointment. Sir Simon has written about and broadcast on Israel and its history. Sir Simon, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our happy tribe, and I'd like to hand over the platform to you.
Okay, thank you. Erev Tov, everybody. And thank you. I think of the Simon Sadie as, we'll call him Superior Simon, so otherwise we'll get very confused. Well, Erev Tov, everybody. It is a huge, huge pleasure to be talking to you on behalf of Yachad, a wonderful organization, and Simon, Superior Simon, will be talking to you in more detail, really, about the extraordinary work it does. But I just want to say that, you know, I go back a long way in my commitment to Israel and to a broad, expansive view of Israel as a home for 2 peoples and many religions. And Yachad seems to be absolutely to be a descendant of that kind of Zionism, which I first imbibed at Habonim and thereafter. But it occurred to me that that in 1948, in May 1948, you'll all probably know this, but I think it bears repetition. The Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel that was read out in the museum in Tel Aviv said, among other things, the following, but the following leaps out from the page. The new state will foster the development of the country for all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, peace. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And so, of course, when the so-called nation-state law was passed, also in May, 3 years ago, in May 2018, a number of us felt unhappy that it was essentially an amendment to this inclusive version of what the State of Israel was supposed to be. I had no particular problem. I will say this about references in the nation-state law about the Jewish homeland and so on. What I did have a problem with, still have a problem with, of course, was the downgrading of Arabic as, in effect, a second language, the kind of hints that part of the function of Israel was to promote settlement. This was very, you'll all know, there was a lot of circumlocution going around when there was a fierce reaction against this among some of us anyway, say we really mean settlement within Israel, we're not talking about the West Bank. Well, yeah, right, sure, Beseda, I don't think so. So it seemed to me a kind of narrowing and a contraction of this idealistic vision on which the state was founded, notwithstanding the many compromises, violations, contradictions that have sprung up in Israel's history since. So I'm particularly, as I say, happy to be speaking to Yachad, which respects those original aims with such energy and with such passion. Now, I think, I say this, I guess, because some of you will realize, as Superior Simon has already said, I'm a historian. And there are two versions, you know, history battles are going on all over the world now, in the United States, where I'm speaking to you, in Israel and in the United Kingdom and pretty much Poland, pretty much there's nowhere in which the history wars aren't proceeding, and they're proceeding in kind of the same way. You can have two views of history, according to me anyway, as far as I'm concerned. One, history is a kind of exercise in self-reinforcement, both consolatory and self-congratulatory. It's a way of looking into the mirror and researching the origins of how absolutely wonderful one's particular tribe is. That's not the way history started. History started with the ancient Greeks, in fact, with Herodotus, above all committed to empathy, above all committed to understanding people who were not necessarily the same as you. So whether I'm right or wrong, whether those who believe as I do are, as it were, the real historians, there is absolutely no doubt for me that part of the joy and the engagement and the passion of history has been reaching towards people who are neighbors or not even neighbors, who are people essentially separated from me by religion, by time, by distance, by space. That's what makes history a truly humane discipline. So I just want to say just a few words about when, in the case of Israel, I was suddenly moved really from one kind of history to the other kind of history. Not that I think I've ever believed or practiced in a kind of self-reinforcing kind of history. I first went to Israel in 1962, but it was 1963, the following year, when I was working on the kibbutz, sort of doing my best to
Simon, we've lost your sound.
I don't know how that happened. All right. Have you all had to lip read me? That actually wouldn't have been an easy thing. I really hope not. Anyway,
we have.
The whole time?
No, only just for the last about 20 seconds.
Okay,
just after you went to kibbutz.
What to do? I love this. This is a kind of test. What was the last thing you heard before you fell asleep?
You'd gone to kibbutz and we were all getting kind of excited.
Nothing. Okay, better Emek, and I went for a walk and took a sandwich with me and sat down amidst ruins. And it was very easy in the early 60s to think about ruins and without, even though I was a baby historian, think about really what they were, think about them as some sort of, leftover rubble from antiquity. But of course they were not. They were the ruins of the Arab village, the Palestinian village of Amka. That was the first, you'll all be surprised at my naivety, I suppose, but that was the first sense of which I had that we shared a narrative with the Palestinians, that this was a conflict of two rights, as a novelist friend of mine once said, and that there were two sets of suffering, and one oughtn't to play the role of whose suffering is the most grievous, whose suffering is the deepest. But it made me feel that part of actually living the history of what made Israel was to understand and put oneself in the shoes of those who of the Palestinians, as well as everything that Jews had suffered, and some of whom were saved by the existence of the Yishuv and then the state of Israel. And many other moments along the road. I suppose if I had to pick out another one further along, I would pick up when we were filming the story of the Jews. And I'm kind of proud of that series, and not least the last program, which is about Israel. And we interviewed and spoke to everybody. We interviewed settlers, but there was a moment when we went to Lifta, which my four colleague panelists will know very well, and some of you I'm sure know very well, just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, which is a Palestinian village. And we interviewed someone who'd been a child in Lifta. It's very beautiful. It's actually a kind of national park now, and a brook runs through it. You can almost see your way. Again, it's one of those spots where you're on the way to the Dead Sea or to the enormous Ma'ale Adumim. And it's a place because actually about 50 houses survive the 47-48 war, notwithstanding the fact that Lifta was badly shot up by Lehi. It also had a Palestinian irregular militia, so it was a battleground, but it was one of those moments really where Lehi just let the guns blaze. And this elderly man, very eloquently and very beautifully, decided not really to go on a polemic, but actually to talk about his childhood. And as he stood there talking about the smell of baking bread and the play of children, and we were listening to the brook, which was indeed babbling away, it was, again, impossible not to feel the closeness, really, of the two cultures through all their conflicts and all their griefs and all their mutual tragedies. I want to switch gear a little bit just for a minute or two, it mustn't go on too long, to say that, one can spend a lot of time, particularly if you're Jewish, wringing your hands and turning Jewish history into an endless chronicle of tsuras, really. But my distinguished predecessor at Columbia, Salo Baron, was famous for saying Jewish history is not simply an unending chronicle, a lachrymose story, not just a story of tears. It's very easy, as Superior Simon has said, to be pessimistic, to be fatalistic. And what is so extraordinarily invigorating and inspiring and exhilarating very often is that younger institutions, which don't simply engage in this battle of competitive victimhood, but actually get down to work to make the possibility of Palestinian and Jewish coexistence within the same land come closer. Two of our colleagues are graduates of Neve Shalom, and Ameer, indeed, as a director of one of the institutes, will come on to big biographies when we start the discussion. But Neve Shalom is a wonderful place, a school which teaches both in Arabic and Hebrew, and both Palestinian and Jewish Israeli children play together. And I stood there in the middle of a riotous football game, thinking, and the shouting, thinking really that the noise of football, even if you're a Spurs supporter, actually doesn't come in exclusively in Hebrew or Arabic. It's a wonderful riot of the mixing of the two. I'm involved with two other wonderful organizations. One is Yad by Yad, Hand in Hand, which, as many of you will know, I hope you know, 7 schools now in Israel, which are governed both by Palestinian and Jewish Israelis. and which teaches, every single class has 2 teachers, which teaches bilingually. And this is a great source of optimism, doesn't disguise the conflicts within the classes when things get difficult. And not least, Echo Peace, which is a particular favorite of mine, an organization especially concerned with the environment, which I'd love to talk about a bit more with our panelists a bit later on. We have offices in Tel Aviv, in Ramallah, and in Amman. And I remember asking, after a session in London, our Palestinian colleague, Nada Majdalani, who runs the Palestinian branch of Echo Peace in Ramallah, how she copes with the regular griefs of politics. And she says, well, we just get on with it. We all, rather like the noise of football, the issue of the water ecology of the Jordan and everything that's damaged about it does not necessarily, by definition, belong to one people or one culture or the other. We get on with it. So it's this kind of practical empathy, which is the wellspring of optimism, which prevents fatalism. And Yachad is very much about pushing back against fatalism, pessimism, and despair. We're not going to have that this evening. And if you do your bit with donations, as I really hope you will push back against pessimism even further. Back to the real Simon.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for those stimulating thoughts. You will probably know that we, in the world before pandemics, can we imagine that world again? We at Yachad regularly took groups to Israel and to the occupied territories, and we visited many places. And some of the comments that you made there reminded me of the last time I was there with a group. We met a very wise Palestinian who told me that progress will come when we all have the ability to listen deeply to the competing narrative of the other. We may not agree with it, but if we can learn to listen deeply to it, then we'll make progress. And I should say that when we were on that visit, we also took the opportunity to visit one of the Yad B'Yad schools, which was an absolutely amazing thing to do. And I can recommend it. And when we finally move out of pandemic, and I hope we're all able to go to Israel again, I would certainly encourage everybody to join a Yachad trip to go and see for yourself and visit these things on the ground, because there is no substitute for actually being there to learn about it. So I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk to you about the work of Yachad, and of course to ask you to donate and to support us. And to begin with, I'd just like to ask you to watch this short video, please.
Yachad prides itself on its exceptional educational work within our community. Through its events, its trips, its speakers, we look to raise the level of the debate and ensure that we have a knowledgeable and informed community.
What we're trying to do is to find a way for diaspora Jews to find their voice, to fight for a different type of future.
Taking part in Yachad events and going on the Yachad student trip gave me incredible confidence to engage with the Board of Deputies, the Union of Jewish Students, and commit myself to Jewish communal life with the skills that I needed to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and every other issue that comes from that.
What Yachad does, which is incredibly important, is it bonds students back into the Jewish community. That's really important for our future, because those students will one day be the leaders of this community.
I welcome Yachad as providing a different perspective an alternative voice that reflects the reality that, of course, within the Jewish community, there is a range of opinions.
I believe, and it's been a long-standing position of the United Kingdom, that we need the two-state solution based on the parameters that are familiar through the Oslo Accord and everything else. But finding an authentic voice in the British Jewish community to articulate that and make clear that that remains very important to the community here is very important.
I'm just going to stay with my video off for 1 second because you should be able to see where my face should be. There's a little symbol there that you can, if you want, just scan briefly using the camera on your phone, and that will enable you to go to a space where you can donate. Okay, so you can see that also on the screen now. You can just pop your phone camera up against that, and you can make a donation using the link that's there, or you can go to the Yachad website, yachad.org.uk/support. Please do that. That film, I think, gives you a feel for just some of the work that Yachad does to raise the voice of the Jewish community in support of a peaceful resolution to the conflict between the state of Israel and the Palestinians. And you may be surprised to learn that Yachad is about to celebrate its 10th anniversary. We had originally hoped to do that all together. And I hope that someday soon we will do that. But of course, that isn't possible now. Nonetheless, we can all celebrate the fact that today Yachad has matured into the most influential progressive voice for peace in this community, with the UK political establishment and with the next generation of British Jews. Yachad ensures that your voice is heard. Now, a year ago, in the most challenging of circumstances, we're all familiar with it, Yachad ensured that your voice was clearly heard in speaking out against proposed annexation, which so gravely threatened the democratic foundations of the state of Israel. I can tell you that every major anti-annexation initiative that came from within the heart of the Anglo-Jewish community was coordinated either publicly or behind the scenes by Yachad. The public letters written to the Board of Deputies asking them to speak out against annexation, signed by 1,000 members of our community. The community letter to the Israeli government, signed by over 100 highly respected international Jewish lawyers, including some of the UK's most well-known former Supreme Court judges. The letter to the Israeli ambassador, penned by over 40 high-profile community philanthropists and public figures. The parliamentary briefings with former Israeli Deputy PM Dan Meridor and former head of the Shin Bet, Ameer. All of these were coordinated by Yachad. Why does this matter? We know that our voice was heard clearly by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and by ministers in Her Majesty's government and by the official opposition. We know that our voice was heard by activists in Israel whose energy and stamina is sustained by the support that they get from us, from you. We know that our voice was heard by partner organisations across the world who share our progressive view. And we know that our voice was heard by the next generation of our community, who gain reassurance that they too can simultaneously be intensely proud of, concerned for, and critical of the state of Israel. We also know through the numbers participating in our campaigns and events that our community really needed and valued our voice throughout this period. Without Yachad, our community's story would have been silence. Communal organisations claimed they couldn't speak out on this topic because there was a difference of opinion in the community. At a time when the path to settlement between Israel and the Palestinians can seem impossible to contemplate, though, might we wonder if one should raise one's voice at all? And I say to you at this moment, when we all might take the silent option, the need for Yachad to speak out on your behalf is more important than ever before. Why? Yachad's capacity for reach and influence has been demonstrated by the fact that over the past year of lockdown life, the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, the British ambassador to Israel, the UK government's Middle East minister and the UK shadow Middle Eastern minister, several past Israeli generals and security service leaders, and many future political leaders in Israel are just some of the people who have chosen to speak to you, our supporters and donors at Yachad's events. Now, you know, we have a very small but very hard-working team at Yachad. I'm very proud of them all. And they achieve the extraordinary, but they can't do it without your support. We do not have another source of funding. We only have you. We need you. So please donate to Yachad tonight. I've personally just done so now using the link that was up on the screen. When you do, you know that you will be investing in our ability to raise the voice of the community in support of a better future for Israel, in which we take such pride, which has a special place in our heart, in whose future we care so much. So thank you. Please take a couple of minutes to make a donation.
Hello again, everybody, and now to the part of the proceedings that you've all especially been waiting for, having made your donation, we all hope. And that's a discussion of the prospects for Israel in the future, and particularly in the light of the last election. When the words last Israeli election immediately gets said, it's impossible not to think the last for the time being. Well, we have four absolutely stellar panelists. I'm really, really happy to be allowing them the opportunity to air their views about this and to engage in the discussion with them. We have Ameer Fakhoury, who's a lawyer and a political sociologist. And I talked a little bit about Neve Shalom, Wahata Salam, which and football going on there, which was such an unforgettably wonderful experience for me. Ameer is head of the Research Institute at Neve Shalom Wahata Salam. We have Fida Nara, who has been co-director of Mahapak Tagir and who specializes particularly in feminist social issues, but just this week or last week, was it last week, Fida? I think has become head of the northern branch of Shatila, the New Israel Fund. So welcome to you. And you were on the Hadash list, I think, was that right, in the election? Right, okay, so you'll still be burning from that. We'll come to you very soon. Efrat Yerday, who is the head of the Association of Ethiopian Jews. I'm so happy to have you here, not only because you're interested in championing Black poetry, in Israel, an absolutely fantastic and important thing to do. One thing about the hideousness of the pandemic is the medicine we all need, not just vaccine, but poetry too. And because I had an amazing experience with Beta Israel Jews when actually we were filming the story of the Jews years ago, which was very heartfelt. And not least Mikhael Manekin, who's director, where are you, Mikhael? There you are, yeah. Director of Israel Tomorrow, and Alliance for the Israeli Future. So all of you absolutely exemplary. You're the living personification against fatalism and pessimism and stuff that occurs to us oldies. So I do want to ask you, nonetheless, it's quite difficult not to be, as Simon said, you know, a little dispirited, put it mildly, when you see Kahanism in the shape of Itamar Ben-Gvir and people like that enter in the Knesset, something I thought was just never going to happen, sort of what a chump I was. When you have the sort of sense in which Israeli politics can be thought to be moving relentlessly rightward and ideologically so, it's easy to get dispirited. So I'd like to, let's start with Ameer. Whether or not this last election, you can expand that actually to the cascade of elections, whether you feel in particular the results of the last one, you know, what can we take from it? Can there are any straws of hope there?
First of all, hello everybody. Thanks for inviting us, and congratulations for Yachad for its 10th anniversary. Good luck with that. About the recent election, the recent election have unfolded many new developments about Israel politics, but I guess it's important from my perspective to emphasize the increasing political willingness of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to engage the national politics, to try and find alliances within the Jewish majority, and as a complementary process to see more and more politicians within the Israeli Jewish politics understanding that there will be no really democratic shift or democratic change without introducing new alliances to the political arena and new binational alliances. So we have in very much unprecedented way, we can see more and more chances and opportunities to cement a new political alliance, to forge a new alliance between Palestinian politics and the politics of what is known here as a central left Zionist politics. So even though there is a very dreadful developments, I guess this is a positive shift, a positive development that we all should invest in it in order to improve the situation and maybe try and achieve a liberal democracy for all sons of daughters of this shared homeland. This is, for me, this is the most important development in the recent election.
Fida, can I ask you whether that surprises you, really? And whether or not, I guess my second question is whether or not, because I'm incredibly heartened by that, but whether or not what we're being heartened by is something essentially tactical, really, or something that really in the practice of politics can actually kind of organically develop into working relationship?
Good evening for everybody, and thank you for invite us to talk. I'm agree a little bit with Ameer, but I just want to add to this more what happened in the Palestinian society inside Israel. Ameer talked about the good news, the new things that's happening, and it's we all can feel it, but most of the population, the Palestinian population, didn't vote in this election. And I think this is the important thing that we should talk about. 55% that didn't vote. And bring back the hope for people, the Palestinian minority inside Israel, that they can change their reality and they can affect the political game. Sorry, I translate from Arabic to Hebrew to English. Is something
in all respects.
So I think it's something that we should ask ourselves as the journalist, as Hadash, it says something about the political situation inside Israel, and it says something about hope and changing the reality. Actually, as a child, when you talk about Kahana, as a child who grown up in Neve Shalom, I remember that he wanted to come and visit the village. And we all, there was a big demonstration with all the people who live in Neve Shalom and with all the left Arab and Jewish people. I remember this day as a child that suddenly a small village became to be a very important place that everybody want to come and be, it's very solidarity with the people in Neve Shalom. And today we see Kahana in the Knesset, and Smotrich said for TB, this is a Jewish country, and if you don't like it, you can left. And he talked about transfer as in a very national way, and nothing happened. And I think this is what brings people to lose their hope that something can change if they will go and vote. I don't accept as a Fida, as a political active, to lose my hope to make this place, to change the reality. So this is what makes me more, I think, in more responsible way as the political Arab activist, what we can do, what we should do, what we should change to make people more involved in the reality here in Israel. And the last thing that I want to add to what's happening is that, unfortunately, nobody talk about the occupation. Nobody talk about the reality here. Nobody talk about the settlement. Nobody, even the journalists and even the Arab parties, which make us, which make, for me, as a big question, what we should do now as a Palestinian minority inside Israel in this issue. And most of the organizations that are very active in this problem or about against occupation are a Jewish organization inside Israel. So the question is how we can bring back the hope for people to be more involved in the political situation inside Israel, and how we can bring the very important issues as occupation to the discussion between, even inside the Palestinian society and between, not talking just about democracy, but talking about two states, talking about justice, talking about, again, the occupation. So,
Mikhael, can I come to you? I mean, that's pessimism with a streak of determination from Fida that actually to engage Palestinians as well as Jewish groups who are determined to speak out about the occupation, and Salem being a radical example of that. I mean, did you feel that also was kind of completely swept under the rug? I mean, we all noticed out in the diaspora, that the obituaries for the Labour Party were rather overdone, And I mean, we're at a position where, again, the Labour Party representation inside Knesset is tiny, but Meretz is there, Labour Party is there. So do you see this as something to build on, or were you sort of more depressed by the result? I mean, everything you hear with Otzma Yehudit and what a horror that was.
Well, first, I mean, hi everyone. First, I think depression is more of a temperament than of a political analysis. And I think activists tend to be optimistic by nature. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the position of trying to affect change. So it's hard for me to coordinate myself emotionally with this sort of dire pessimism. I mean, obviously, we wake up many mornings frustrated, but I also think it's clear that the situation is ever changing. It's clear that one day the occupation will end. It's clear that there will be from my personal Israeli progressive perspective, it's clear that Israeli progressivism will be more coherent in the future and stronger. And the question is, what role as activists do we have to play in that arena? And I mean, you pointed out the issue, and Fida as well pointed out the issue of occupation. I think there are two issues which are interesting to me as a left political activist. The first is, of course, re-engaging with occupation in a political way. And you're right to say that there isn't much or isn't enough talk about it at all. By the way, it is worth mentioning, if we're trying to be optimistic, that the Zionist left did double itself in size in the last elections, and I think that's no small feat. And I think very important, I'm a card-carrying member of the Labour Party, and that means I have a ton of complaints about the Labour Party. But it also means that I'm aware that that's a game that we need to play with and that we need to be part of in order to affect change. So the first is the issue of occupation, and I'll mention here that I'm a former director of Breaking the Silence and frustratingly aware about the lack of conversation about occupation, but things like that can change. And the second is the issue which we keep on coming back to, and which is what's so exciting for me in this panel, is that the key to changing, I think, progressivism in Israel is understanding national identities better, working together, Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel, in a more structured and coherent and ideological way, not only because it makes our camp much stronger, which it does, but also because it makes progressivism much more coherent, as I said. I mean, what does it mean to be a left-wing Israeli in 2021? I think is a question that I constantly come back to. And what does it mean for me as a Jew with a lot of power to be somebody who cares about equality? And what does that mean in terms of my privileges? And what does it mean in terms of how I work with Fida, or how I work with Ameer? We all, by the way, Ameer, Efrat, Fida, and I work very closely together. We're all very good friends. But it's clear to us that Jews on the left in Israel and Arabs on the left in Israel have a lot of work to do together, even within our own camp, to create a functioning left or a functioning progressive cause. So yes, the lack of occupation conversation is very frustrating. The fact that progressives are smaller than I wish they were is very frustrating. I think all of that makes complete sort of analytical sense because the main political project of our country right now is occupying 5 million people. And if the main political project is occupying people, it makes sense that the identity of the country will be prone towards that. We understand that we're a minority, but I think I think it's an important minority, and I think the support of Yachad makes that minority count more. So maybe I'll just end that perhaps optimistic note with saying thank you to everybody here in the room, as that it's clear to us. I mean, I've been in the progressive sort of game for a while now. I think since Yachad started, maybe even a bit before, and the fact that there are supporters around the world to the type of work that we're doing is immensely important.
Yeah, I think you should feel also, with my American hat on, really passionate support, really, you know, across the great, we have lots of progressive Jews, you know, voicing their feelings about all this, and needless to say, arguing with each other. Efrat, I want to, if you let me, I'd love you to speak, by all means, sort of speak to how you feel as, you know, coming out of the election, but particularly a point that Mikhael kind of raised, you know, the social element inside the progressive politics in Israel. And, you know, as someone at the heart of Ethiopian Jews, there are so many kinds of issues of social equality and social justice, you know, which remain really painful and difficult. And the same thing, of course, actually, you know, one of the facts, quite apart from the kind of brutal military aspects of the occupation, about what's happening to Palestinians is their impoverishment, really. And so I'm just wondering, you know, whether or not it's quite difficult, or correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems from the outside to have been quite difficult in actually forging alliance between people who are on the raw end of social justice, the social injustice inside Israel, like the Better Israel community, and the fate and the conditions in the occupation, and indeed conditions in some Palestinian Israeli communities as well. Is that an issue for you? Or?
Wow, that's a long question.
Yes,
Hi,
I'm sorry. That's one of my many hopeless inadequacies. One day I'll learn to speak concisely, but it's probably after I'm dead. You know.
Okay, so I want to add to what everybody said. I think that you started with the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, but we know that while the Declaration of Independence was happening, villages were destroyed, people were sent to exile, and we also know from this, I don't need to speak further about it, but we also know from my perspective that the State of Israel did not only rejected and denied and did all these bad things we know from history to Palestinians, but it also denied and rejected from the very beginning Ethiopian Jews. I will, as a PhD student as well, I won't say, of course it was racism. It's many things that connected to this agenda of the State of Israel that was established from day one of the State of Israel. So forgive me if I don't have much expectations from the last elections. So I think what we're trying to do as political activists and in the left camp in Israel is to try and enter through the small, how you say, pirtzot, like the small spaces that been left from what we call Jewish and democratic, first Jewish, then democratic, and try to change some of the problems that minority face in Israel. Firstly, the Palestinians in Israel and in the occupied territories, and then all other Jews in Israel that actually are not white, Ashkenazi, European. So I think we need also to acknowledge the fact that there is the vision of the State of Israel and what we call historiography and the story that the State of Israel want to tell about itself. And there is the reality we live and the history I know from my research, from my parents, from many of Ethiopian Jews that tried to enter Israel as Jews, as citizens, and were denied by the state until actually for 36 years. So this is my perspective about how to work in this political space.
How would you, forgive me interrupting, Efrat, how would you do this in practical terms now? I mean, rather than, you know, I absolutely agree with you. It strikes me, you know, education is a crucial thing in both communities, really, in the Palestinian community and the Jewish community. And education, you know, there's a Kulturkampf, you know, there's a kind of culture war going on in Israel between secular Jews and you know, religious Jews of an extreme kind, which makes it very difficult, doesn't it, to mediate these issues through education?
I think that the work of my organization is policy change, that we don't want to speak with individuals. We think that when you change policy, you affect the masses. And when you change the policy in the Ministry of Education of how they teach, now we can do it. It's very hard. We can do it about the story of the Ethiopian Jews. With the case of the Palestinians, it's actually impossible to change the history programs in school and how you're not allowed to mention the Nakba. You're not allowed to mention anything about it. So I guess for Palestinians, it will be harder, but also to tell the story about Ethiopian Jews that were rejected by the state by many excuses, it's very hard to change that. But what we do in other fields, like in employment, in regarding to police brutality and the expanded authorities of the wide authorities that any police officer have when he asks for ID, and most of the people that get hurt from that are brown and black, Arab, and Mizrahi Israelis. So actually, we just won a petition that we applied to court that the police police officer allowed to ask for an ID from anyone with no reason. So we ask from court to demand from the police a clear criteria of when you ask for identification from any citizen. So this is something that we are like Ethiopian and Palestinians NGO usually will work on, and this is something that is less relevant for. Of course, I'm generalizing, but mostly it's not relevant to white Ashkenazi Israelis. So this is kind of work we will do. For example, there is a affirmative action in employment in the public
sector, public sector.
Sorry.
So it used to be relevant to women and to Arabs, Arabs, and Haredi. I'm not sure even that it was relevant to Arabs. And then in 2011, we changed the law. We managed to change the law that it will include also Ethiopian citizens, Ethiopian Israelis. So these are kind of things that I think can affect on the masses of people. Because when there are programs about intercultural relations and we need to know the other. There is no other, like, we are different people, we're all individuals, and there is a policy a policy of different authorities to not take in account the majority of the people. So this is how we practically work on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, you're being blunt about, the uphill battle. Let me change tack just a little bit, actually, and something significant just to show that change can happen. We have a completely different kind of administration in the White House in Washington, D.C. now. Any rumors about who the American ambassador to Israel will be? I don't know, I haven't heard them, but things that it's not just that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have replaced Donald Trump and Mike Pence, but we have an absolutely, utterly different approach to what government can or can't do. And the pandemic, of course, actually has made that actually possible. I wondered actually whether, in particular, the experience of the pandemic and, you know, the difficult issues that came out about how the Palestinians would actually get their vaccine, and Israeli arguments about whether or not, I mean, that's actually created more abrasive problems in understanding between two communities, or whether the pandemic has actually raised possibilities that Yachad, a certain amount of togetherness, is indispensable. Do you want to talk to that, Ameer?
Yes, of course. Bearing in mind that these two peoples here lack a flag to rally around. They don't have any shared ethnicity. They don't have any shared narrative. They don't share any national identity, let alone recognized national identity. So it's really difficult to bring them to rally around a flag that is enough significant to bring them together. So the pandemic really, in this context, have emphasized their shared existential terms, the being as a co-citizens and as co-nationals in the shared homeland. I'm speaking within Israel proper and in homeland terms. In the pandemic really, in that way, really helped us to fill in one of the most difficult issues, finding a significant flag to rally around. So, and this this shared existential feeling of shared fate have really sinked into the political national discourse in both sides. We've heard a lot of both Israeli Jewish and Arab Palestinian politicians using this reality, this new reality, which unfolded with the COVID pandemic crisis, to emphasize that before or after all, we have a shared fate derived from maybe the most real experience, sharing the same space, time, homeland, and I hope that it will not be a fading sentiment or a fading political resource to utilize in this effort. But until now, from my perspective, it was harnessed positively in the endeavor of forging co-national alliances.
I'm wondering if any of you, this is a bit of a bee in my bonnet, as you'll know. Maybe, Fida, this is interesting to you or not, but possibly not, and Mikhael. But I mentioned very briefly environmentalism as well. And, you know, EcoPeace in particular, it makes the point over and over again that the fate of the Jordan Valley, relentless and brutal periods of droughts actually causing a kind of collapse of agricultural economy, you know, in the upwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris. But there is, again, no real division between, you know, Ameer's just spoken about a kind of shared fate. That is true of environmental issues as well, particularly issues of water and solar energy. I mean, is that the sort of practical thing that you think also might, whatever the differences and divisions and polarizations of narrative, might actually make for, you know, a working community?
Mute.
Anyone, yeah, Mikhael, anybody who wants to.
I'll go after that.
Or none of you may want to. I don't know.
Okay, so I'll start and then Fida after. Look, you're right, and Ameer, I think, are very correct in pointing out the shared geography and the shared space, and obviously the environmental issue is crucial in that regard. And by the way, environmental issues in COVID hit well, because we know that there's also less environmental security for poorer communities. Just the idea of access to electricity and so on. And those are issues that some of us here are working on. But there's a shared fate and there's a shared space, but there isn't shared ownership. And I think that's something that needs to be understood. And I think that's the challenge of progressivism in Israel, and I think around the world today, because unless there's shared ownership, then there can't be shared responsibility, and there will always be, even for us as Israelis, usually we supply equality, but the end game shouldn't be that I give Ameer and Fida equality because I grant them that. It is that it's a shared ownership to begin with, and that's a change, by the way. And Ameer is smiling because this is something that I learned from Ameer, but in terms of the framing, so shared ownership means different things in different contexts. Shared ownership towards the Palestinians living under subjugation and under military rule in the West Bank and Gaza means that they need to be liberated from our control and need to have their sovereignty. Shared ownership within Israel proper is that it is not only the righteous Jews who supply equality towards our Palestinian citizens, but we own this country. Ameer, I think the analogy you once gave me is that you don't want a check which is equal to my check given from me, but you want to be the one writing the checks as well. And that's something which I think is a powerful message and sentiment to move forward. And I think within the context of COVID is very, very strong, because I'm sure like all over the world, the people who suffered most from COVID in this country are the poorer classes, be they Mizrahi, or be they Ethiopian, or be they ultra-Orthodox, or be they Palestinian citizens of Israel. And of course, subjugation even more so, Palestinians who are living under military rule. And the question we must ask ourselves as progressive Israelis, and I say this as a Zionist Israeli, is can I conceptualize a Jewish nationalism which is not the sole owner of the state? And I think that is the major challenge of our generation of progressives, is not only can I imagine equality, but can I imagine shared ownership?
Mm. Fida, we're running out of time, alas, and we could go on much, much longer. But I'd love to ask you all, beginning with Fida, whether or not overall, particularly in the light of what Mikhael has said, sort of accepting truths about truly shared ownership, whether you're feeling optimistic about, I don't know, the next 10 years or so, if you, or whether in spite of all your good work, it seems to be getting darker and darker.
Actually, I don't, as a woman, I will choose now not to talk about feeling, but continue talking about the reality. And I want to add for the word justice. When we talk about justice, it means that it's more people will take different from other, which means sometime as a very privileged Palestinian woman inside Israel, maybe even I should take less than a Jewish man who live in the periphery. What we try to talk about here is talking about challenging reality. Is Israel can be a Jewish country and democracy in the same time? This is the question that we should ask ourselves, and that's when we will start to talk about it. We will start to talk about real partnership, and not just partnership that you can bring the Arab to the government and they can say nothing about the occupation. Is this real partnership? Is this something that can change the reality? The answer is no. And we can see it with Abbas, with the Islamic Party, and we see it now, their partnership with the right in Israel. The question is, if every child in Israel have the same right for education, and not just for water. Even we see it in the COVID-19. people in the periphery, Arab children from unrecognized villages, didn't have the same right for education even. And when we talk about safe space, last day, 3 guys in the Arab society died because of the problem of gun and crime in the Arab society. So this is one of the really hard problems that we live in the Palestinian society. Nothing happened in Israel, nothing changed, because when it's in the Arab society, it didn't, nobody take care for this. It's Arab people who kill each other so they can continue do their work. So the question is not just about, when we talk about justice, we talk about justice not just between Arab and Jewish, between Palestinian and Jews inside Israel, which is very important. We talk about issues of class, issues of gender inside Israel that we need to take care. Me and Efrat talk about a lot about how the police treat Arab and Ethiopian people inside Israel. But still, when you Arab, it's hard percent that you can killed by the police. From the first of this year, 3 guys killed by the police in the Arab society. So this is the reality of justice. I cannot lose the hope. First of all, if I will lose the hope, I will not be in the NGOs. But I will challenge, first of all, we should challenge ourselves. We should be the people who write who sign the check, not just in the government, even in the left NGOs inside Israel. Let's ask ourselves the hard question. Is really in left organization, Jewish organization inside Israel, are Arab in a very high position? The question is not. So even before we talk about the left and the political, let's talk about our area, what's happening in our area. So optimistic, I'm all the time is optimistic. I do this because of my children, because of my belief, because of my, we cannot be not optimistic. The other way I will go and work in other things. But we need to work very hard together to make the reality change here in Israel.
Efrat, I'll let you have the last word. What would you say to everybody looking in, and all have good reasons to support Yachad, but what would you say to everybody as the absolutely essential reason to take Yachad's work further? We want to hear from you.
I think that to continue what all the panelists said and what Fida said, in order to be a strong left and to have a space also in the leftist organization in Israel to have a real dialogue, to make change in our dialogues and discussion and hierarchies that exist in the left NGOs as well. We need your support. We need you to see that and to invite us to talk with you and to continue this dialogue, because many times we have the Jewish supporters like liberal organization around the world that are not enough, liberal communities of Jews that are not enough involved in what we're doing, and we kind of working in separate fields. So we need your support, and we need you to hear about our work and what are the practice and the work we do here in Israel.
Thank you, you've been incredibly eloquent, and I can't imagine anybody looking at this and not thinking actually that airing all these problems and being able to talk about them with honesty and passion and without any kind of complacency at all, you know, isn't an extraordinarily important incentive to support Yachad. Yachad being together means not just being together in Israel and between Israeli Jewish and Palestinian communities, but between us in the Galut, in the diaspora, and you. So let's do this every week. Joking, but certainly regularly. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to listen to you. And I think I'm now handing over to my commander, Simon, in the gallery there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Thank you also to Ameer, Fida, Efrat, and Mikhael. They're not leaving us yet. Really fascinating to listen to them talk, and I think just it reminds me every time when I join these groups that this is the heart of Yachad, bringing these this range of progressive campaigners together and enabling us to very optimistically see what the great work that's still being done to progress these causes in Israel. So thank you so much. That does bring us to the end of the main session this evening, but there is now a chance for all of you to talk to one of our inspiring guests this evening and to ask them any questions that you may have. Each of our guests will shortly be hosted in a breakout room, and you'll be able to choose in a moment to join one of them using links at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you'd like to do so, please just wait to see the links and click on the room you'd like to join, and the magic of Zoom will do the rest. For those of you that are leaving, thank you for joining us. As you go, please remember that you have one hugely important task to complete today if you've not already done so, and that is to donate to Yachad. We need you. And finally, let me say once more a huge thank you to Sir Simon for hosting the evening. We hugely appreciated that. Have a good evening.